In wartime Europe, there was a unit that fought with paint, plywood, rubber, microphones, and lies. Its soldiers carried pistols but preferred pencils. They could stitch an infantry division together from canvas by noon and make it vanish by dawn. They could make a single radio set sound like an army corps, and one loudspeaker roll like an armored column in the fog. They called themselves the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but the name that stuck was simpler and stranger: the Ghost Army. They were costume designers, billboard painters, stage riggers, sound engineers, admin, architects, illustrators, and radio wizards drafted into a war that needed not only firepower but imagination. They landed after D-Day, moved east with the front, and set up shop wherever a commander whispered, "Make the enemy look that way, not this way." This is the long, careful story of how artists fooled Hitler, not with one grand stunt, but with dozens of small, disciplined deceptions stacked into a new kind of weapon. Picture France in the late summer of 1944. Hedgerows torn open by tanks, chalk dust on boots, road signs hastily painted and repainted, the smell of gasoline and crushed apples. The Ghost Army arrives with crates that do not rattle like ammunition. They bring compressors, fabric skins, collapsible frames, ropes, stakes, reels of wire, spools of canvas tape, bundles of shoulder patches, and cartons of inked stamps. The first lesson they teach any curious onlooker is silence. Their operations only work if no one brags, if the new friend you make at a field kitchen doesn't wander over at sunset and touch a tank that weighs 90 pounds. They run their shows under classification so tight that many infantrymen bivouacked a kilometer away never know they slept beside an army made of air. The unit is a composite of 4 specialties designed to work like fingers of a single hand. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers provide the visual illusions: rows of rubber Shermans, 30-foot howitzers with aluminum spades, tent cities that look lived in from a reconnaissance plane. The Signal Company Special handles radio deception, operators who memorize the rhythm and quirks of the divisions they impersonate, and then reproduce those quirks over the ether with such fidelity that German listeners believe a headquarters has moved. The Sonic Deception Company, sound men with theater backgrounds, carry huge amplifiers in shellac or magnetic recordings of engines clanking, bridge timbers hammering, chains dragging, shouted orders, all mixed into soundscapes they can throw for miles down a valley at night. And there is a small engineer company that builds and booby-traps the stage, stringing wire, laying fake tracks, knocking together roadblocks, erecting fake command posts with real-looking field telephones and cigarette butts ground into the mud outside the door. The heart of their visual magic is air. Inflatable tanks arrive in folded slabs, smelling faintly of rubber and talc. 2 men snap on a hose, the compressor coughs, and in 90 seconds the limp carcass swells into a turreted silhouette that from 200 meters at dusk could pass for a Sherman ready to lurch forward. Ropes vanish under sod. A corporal sprinkles mud along the skirts to kill the factory shine. Another soldier paints a serial number by hand, copying the style he's seen on the real thing. A third drags a sled behind a jeep to stamp broad, parallel tracks through the grass so that the ground tells the same story the air does. Heavy machines sat here. They hang fake camouflage netting because the real army hangs real nets. They put out laundry lines because men in the field always do. They park empty gasoline cans in tidy pyramids and let a few fall over because carelessness that looks honest persuades better than perfection. Authenticity is 100 small decisions. A camouflage sergeant knows a recon pilot will study shadows, so he stakes his decoys where the sun will cast convincing lines at midday. He knows a German photo interpreter will count tents and vehicles, so he sets ratios that match the tables of organization for whatever division he's impersonating. So many trucks per battalion, so many staff cars for a headquarters, so many kitchens and latrines for that mix of men. He knows an aerial photo shows trash as well as tents, so he scatters a day's worth of paper scraps in the right places and tramples them in with boots smeared in the same mud the real units tread. He knows that a truly empty road looks suspicious when the army claims to be moving there, so he chalks faint tire marks down the verge and sets a pair of military police at a crossroads with armbands and the right patches to wave imaginary convoys through. A deception site lives or dies by the tiny lies no one notices. Radio is the second finger, and it is as intimate as handwriting. Every division's net has a personality, an operator who keys fast, one who is fussy with procedure, another who always clips numbers, a tech sergeant who uses a favorite phrase when he's impatient. The signal company special collects these tics the way an actor collects mannerisms. When the Ghost Army is ordered to impersonate the 4th Armored Division, their radio men adopt 4th Armored's rhythm, its call signs, net discipline, chatter density, message timing. They transmit from the right places on the map at the right hours, sometimes stationary, sometimes moving as if the staff were on the road between 2 villages. They seed the air with enough routine to convince a German listener that life is normal over there, and then they add 1 or 2 deliberate hints, mentions of fuel dumps, probe patrols, a pontoon train's arrival. None of it too loud, all of it plausible. Deception radio hates exclamation points, it loves commas and ordinary verbs. Sound is the 3rd finger, and it plays at night. The Sonic Company mounts screaming amplifiers on half-tracks and parks them under trees with sound reflectors slanted just so. They have records of tanks idling, tanks changing gears, tanks crossing bridges. They have the creak and clack of track suspensions recorded at different speeds and different loads. They have the brittle whine of winches. They have the whack of sledgehammers on pontoon pins. They have the muffled exchange of shouted orders in English and the non-words of fatigue. A soundman builds a program the way a composer builds a movement, 20 minutes of convoy approach, the clump and squeal of a halt, the rise and fall of shouted positioning, the wooden drum of a bridge being pinned, a long half-hour of engines grumbling in a cold line, and finally the distant receding pull of throttle as the first company of vehicles rolls across water. Germans on the far bank hear this through trees and wind and fog and report what any rational soldier would report. A crossing is forming, artillery should range in, reserves should wake. The 4th finger is the stagecraft they call atmospherics. If you want the enemy to believe that a famous general has taken charge of a road sector, you put a tent there with the right stencil on the flap, and you erect a small cluster of antennas at the correct height, and you stage a security perimeter of MPs who look bored but not too bored. You put the right shoulder patch on a Jeep headed to the market that morning so that civilians who talk to the Germans talk about who they've seen. You leave rumors out like breadcrumbs and make sure the right local hears them. We're short on bridging. The 9th Armored is here. We expect to move north tomorrow. The show is never performed for one audience. It is performed for the overlapping audiences of aerial cameras, listening posts, ground patrols, gossips, and hunches. Their first weeks in France teach them that the best deceptions are small, near, and timely. Pretending to be an entire army group for weeks on end is a grand theater that few can pull off. Pretending to be a single division for 48 hours while the actual division turns its gun somewhere else is both practical and powerful. The Ghost Army practices their craft in Brittany, in the hedgerows near the Loire, along the Moselle where every village has a church spire and a field large enough for a tank park, in the approach to the Siegfried Line where dragons' teeth saw up through pasture grass. Sometimes they pull the enemy's artillery away from a thin line, sometimes they keep a row quiet by making another look busy, sometimes they simply confuse, and in war confusion is mercy. They learn to fear their own success. If you build a camp too perfectly and you invite a barrage, you must be ready to live under it. The inflatable tanks will not burn convincingly unless you dress them with a smear of gasoline and a sprinkling of oil, but you cannot set that fire if the shells are real and landing now. They carry small arms and dig foxholes like everyone else because the shells that find them do not discriminate between rubber and steel on the way down. They learn to move quickly and leave almost nothing behind but footprints and tent peg scars so that when the reconnaissance plane comes back the next afternoon, it sees an army that has already moved. They learn to change patches on their shoulders as often as actors change costumes, because today they are the 4th Armored and tomorrow they are the 9th, and next week they are the 2nd Infantry, and no one must ever catch a soldier wearing yesterday's lie. They collect a gallery of characters. A fashion student from Indiana who will one day cut dresses for Manhattan sketches, tank silhouettes on cardboard by lantern light. A billboard artist from Philadelphia knocks out a division sign in 5 minutes with such swagger that an MP uses it at a crossroads for a day before anyone notices it points nowhere. A radio man from Detroit with a lazy left hand becomes the voice of 3 different regiments by varying his spacing and his mistakes. A sound engineer who once mixed a Broadway orchestra keeps a little notebook of ambient frequencies for each valley. He can tell you by ear how far a bridge-building trackbed will carry in fog. They remember the infantrymen who wander through their fake parks and grin when they first put a palm to a rubber hull that flexes. They remember a colonel who walks among the inflatables with a thin smile and says, "Gentlemen, if the enemy artillerists are good, they'll zero you first. Godspeed." They remember the first time they pack a sight in the rain and a gust of wind catches a half-deflated tank and lifts it like a clumsy kite. They wrestle the thing down in laughter that sounds a little like panic and a little like pride. Then winter bites into them. The Ardennes, the long nights, the bite of iron on skin, the shock of German armor roaring west when everyone thought the war would be over by Christmas. Deception shifts from feints to shields. They use sound to thicken quiet sectors. They plant radio ghosts to persuade the enemy that a reserve sits where a hole actually yawns. They impersonate divisions that have been mauled and need time to patch themselves back together. The ghost army is a pause button pressed by artists. Every 12 hours they can buy, someone else lives. They are not the reason the counteroffensive fails, but they are one of the small reasons that add up. When the weather clears and the front steadies and the push turns east again, the unit becomes what it was made to be. A lantern in a dark field waved where you want the wolves to bite. Their largest show builds on the Rhine in early March 1945. The real crossing preparations churn and clank under secrecy a few miles away. The Ghost Army erects a shadow crossing to the north to pull attention and shells. They scatter a regiment-sized tank park, groom roads to look overused, set up pontoon tool piles, hang marker lights low among the willows, and run a sound program of bridge work that rises at dusk and falls near midnight as if units were staging by phases. Radio traffic hints at logistics, fuel at this grid, engineers delayed by mud, a staff car asking for an updated artillery schedule. Reconnaissance planes photograph an American presence where in fact there are megaphones and mannequins. Counter-battery radars on the German side report activity, and somebody assigns guns to address it. Those guns are not ranging the real bridging sites when the moment comes. The next morning a few craters pock the fields where rubber tanks slept. A staff officer with dark circles under his eyes signs a note. Deception effective. Maintained for 24 hours. Between operations, the Ghost Army draws. They draw each other in tents, sketch villagers carrying bread, watercolor brick barns with missing corners, pin the shoulders of mechanics greased and asleep under trucks, make lithographs of rivers with trusses like steel combs laid on their backs. Some of these men will become famous in peacetime. Some will never exhibit again. In that winter they make pictures because it is the one weapon they have that can take fragments of a day and make them orderly again. They mail small cartoons home, fold magazine clippings into wallets, swap sketches for cigarettes. A few keep journals that will decades later become the backbone of the story you are hearing now, because for a long time it was a secret, and then for a while it was simply forgotten, and only when gray hair and empty afternoons met a historian's patience did the full shape of the unit step out of the fog. The ethics of what they do are clean by the standards of war. No one is poisoned, no one is tortured, no one is turned into a demonstration piece. And yet it is a strange business, making yourself into bait. A deception crew digs a foxhole beside a rubber howitzer and waits to see if the enemy believes enough to shoot at them. They move among their own inventions with a calm that is half craft pride and half denial, because if an artillery observer is good enough, he will notice the tiny ripples in the lie, the way the canvas edge refuses to cast a sharp shadow, the way the weight of footprints around a tank does not match the alleged tons parked there, the way an antenna's guidelines make the wrong angles. Deception is a duel between makers and measurers. For every technique the Ghost Army invents to add texture to a scene, an interpreter somewhere invents a rule to test that texture. The unit wins when the enemy does not have time to test, when he must act on first impressions. In a fluid battlefield, first impressions are often all anyone has. There are small, sharp moments no one forgets. A pair of MPs in borrowed patches stand at a crossroads and wave a real armored battalion down a road the Ghost Army needs to look busy. A major leans out of a turret and curses because his map says turn left. The MP says, "Sir, division changed orders an hour ago." And the major glares and then shrugs and grinds forward. And an hour later the deception site looks plausible because of the tracks the real tanks left. A German patrol creeps near a fake park at dusk and hears the soft thump of a canvas panel settling in the cold. They fire. Someone yells. the patrol retreats, a shell lands, and a rubber Sherman sighs and balls with a hiss, and the men in the nearest hole laugh without pleasure. A sound truck broadcasts bridge noise across a river. A German battery answers with a bracket of shells. The sound crew kills power, and the night snaps to quiet so sudden that birds burst out of reeds in a black cloud and drift downriver like ash. One of the rarely told parts of the story is how often deception protects not only frontline infantry, but also the supply lines and the little artifices that keep an army alive. Pole dumps, petrol, oil, lubricants, stashed under netting, engineer parks crammed with pontoon bays, railheads where cranes lift crates of rations like clockwork. A fake fuel farm that draws artillery fire is not merely a clever trick, it is a margin of survival for the trucks that would have burned. A decoy headquarters with the right wire runs coiled by the tent door is not merely theater, it is a shield for the officers planning the next day's movements a few miles away. In modern terms, the Ghost Army creates bandwidth for the real army to operate by absorbing some of the enemy's attention. Attention is a resource measured in minutes and degrees, they steal both. There are times when deception fails. A photo interpreter notices a seam wrong and calls in a correction. A patrol walks too close and touches canvas. A local civilian, paid in cigarettes or simply eager to tell a story, mentions to a German agent that the camp full of tanks never seems to leave tracks on the main road. The Ghost Army learns to accept the limits of its art. A decoy is a probability engine, not a guarantee. You can push the odds toward you with craft, but you cannot promise that a particular enemy commander will believe. You can only create reasonable belief and hope it collides with his fear. They do their last work in Germany among villages with roofs punched out and orchards that look as though a giant hand raked them. The Rhine is behind them, the Ruhr pocket surfaces, and a sense spreads through the ranks that the story is nearly finished. Men relax a notch and then instantly feel strange for relaxing. The unit impersonates a few more divisions to cover a few more moves, and then one day an officer gathers them and says the thing everyone has been bracing to hear. It is over here, it is nearly over everywhere. They deflate tanks, clean brushes, rewind cables onto drums, wrap microphones in felt, break down plywood frames, and for the first time in months do not glance at the sky to imagine a camera's eye. They pack their lies in crates and send them west. After the war, they are told they did well and told to keep quiet. Many do. A few write down memories and put the notebooks in drawers. A fashion student becomes a fashion name. A painter becomes a painter. A radio man sells appliances. A sound engineer records symphonies. Decades pass. A historian finds a box labeled in a dry hand and opens it and discovers photographs of tanks that could be carried by two men, patches from divisions the photographer never served in, road signs to towns that do not exist, and a mimeographed manual for throwing sound across water. The story unspools slowly. The world is surprised that such a unit existed so fully and said so little for so long. What the Ghost Army teaches is not simply that deception works, but that deception works when it is grounded in empathy for the observer. Every choice they make begins with the question, what do we want the enemy to believe, and what set of sights and sounds would a reasonable, tired, hurried human being accept as evidence for that belief? They do not build perfect illusions, they build convincing contexts. They aim for plausibility, not magic. Their art is humble, and that is why it is dangerous. A rubber tank does not need to look like a tank to a curator, it needs to look like a tank to a corporal with binoculars at last light. They also remind us that artists and engineers are closer cousins than we sometimes admit. The billboard man and the radio man both think in layers: foreground, midground, background, carrier, modulation, noise. The costume designer and the sound mixer both ask how small choices, stitch color, a faint clank, change a scene's credibility. The architect laying out a decoy park thinks like a dramaturge blocking a stage. Where will the audience look first? What will they check second? How do we hide the scenes without smothering the story? In peacetime, this kind of thinking sells perfumes and movies and campaigns. In war, it saves lives without anyone ever seeing a muzzle flash. The men of the Ghost Army do not decide grand strategy. They do not raise flags over capitals. But at crossroads quiet and muddy, they tilt the odds. They buy hours. They bend maps by a mile or two. In a war of millions, that sounds small. To the platoon that didn't receive an artillery concentration because a rubber howitzer did, it is not small. To the engineers who set a real bridge while the enemy shelled a phantom, it is not small. To a young private who walked past a row of inflatable tanks on his way to sleep and woke up the next morning, alive and sore and hungry and alive, it is not small at all. There is one last image to hold. A field at dawn, mist lying low, birds already up. In the middle distance, 30 tanks in tidy lines, shadows, hulks, the promise of momentum. 2 men walk among them with wrenches and knives. One by one the tanks slump inward as the valves open. One by one the silhouettes give up their shapes and become puddles of canvas, straps, and rubber smelling faintly of dust and rivers. From the air the change would look like a conjurer's trick reversed, an army melting. On the ground it looks like laundry day. The men fold their weapons of air into bundles and load them onto trucks. The trucks take a rutted road that leads east, then south, then anywhere a commander needs belief more than bullets. Somewhere beyond the trees, real engines start, a deep collective hum that is not a record, not a show, not a lie. The war goes on for a few more weeks, then it doesn't. The men go home. For a long time they say nothing. And that too was part of the weapon, invisibility after impact. Years later, when the story is told and medals are pinned and grandchildren ask whether the tanks were real, an old man smiles and says, "They were real enough for the job." That is the right answer. Reality in war is a contract between what you can do and what the other side must decide. The Ghost Army wrote their clauses with fabric and sound in cipher. They signed with footprints and coffee rings and the faint smudge of charcoal on a wooden stake where someone tested a brush before painting a serial number in the half-light. They made belief. They made time. They made room for other men to do the loud work. And in the record of a hard continent, that quiet is as honorable as any thunder.